rain fell in thin, icy sheets, hammering the cracked asphalt like a drumbeat. The world had forgotten. The puppy shivered in the tiny hole he had dug himself, the edges of earth pressing against his damp fur, a fragile shield from a world that barely noticed him. His stomach growled, a hollow echo that matched the hollow feeling in his chest. Above him, thousands of feet pounded past, indifferent, some hurrying with umbrellas, others scowling at the puddles, all blind to the trembling shadow curled into the mud. Every drop of water that slipped down the walls of his bunker felt like a warning, like the world outside was a roaring ocean. And he was nothing but a fragile driftwood. He pressed himself lower into the soil, ears flattened, heart thudding like a drum he could not escape. The smell of gasoline and wet trash clung to his coat. Somewhere far off, a car horn blared. He whimpered, a tiny, desperate sound, and no one paused, no one ever paused. And yet, in that moment of cold and hunger, a spark of stubborn life flared in his chest. He was too small, too unseen, too alone. But he would survive. Somehow he had to. The rain had been falling for hours, long enough to turn the cracked sidewalk into a patchwork of puddles that shimmered like broken glass. The puppy huddled in the hollow he had dug himself, the edges of wet earth pressing against his trembling body, pressing him into himself like he could disappear into the soil. It was his fortress, his tiny bunker, carved out of desperation and instinct, yet it felt impossibly fragile against the roar of the city. Every drop of water that dripped from the crumbling walls of his hole sounded louder than the footsteps that passed by above him. The world was a tide of noise and motion, and he was nothing but a shadow pressed into the dirt. Hunger gnawed at him relentlessly, an ache that curled into his belly like twisting vines. He had learned to ignore it most of the time, focusing instead on the rhythm of survival, the pull of instinct that whispered, "Stay low, stay still, stay alive." The air was thick with the smell of wet asphalt, trash, and gasoline. Each breath burned his lungs slightly, but he could not leave outside the hollow. The world was chaotic and cruel. Feet slammed down, tires squealed on slick streets, and the occasional bark of a larger dog echoed off the buildings like cannon fire. Every sound was a warning. The puppy flattened himself against the muddy wall, ears pressed to his head, trying to disappear into the very earth he had clawed out. A small piece of cardboard, sodden and curled, offered a semblance of shelter against the relentless drizzle, but even that could not fully protect him. He shook, wet fur clinging to tiny bones, and shivered from both cold and the constant thrum of tension that never left him. The hole smelled like him now. His own fear, his own hunger, his own desperate clinging to life. Every inch of soil was pressed with memory. The first time he had dug here when the world had been unbearably loud and terrifying. The first time he had curled into the dirt to hide from the shadow of a man with boots that had come too close. He remembered the ache of loneliness, of being overlooked, unseen, passed by as if he were nothing, and yet he lived. Somehow he always lived. That stubborn spark of life refused to extinguish. He pressed his nose against the mud, tasting the bitter tang of wet earth mixed with rain, and closed his eyes, letting the world shrink down to the walls of his tiny refuge. Above, the city moved like a river that had forgotten to pause. A woman's umbrella splashed through a puddle, sending a wave that washed over the edges of his hole. The puppy froze, heart hammering, claws digging into the soft soil to keep himself grounded. He whimpered quietly, a sound small enough to be swallowed by the city's roar, and wished, with every fragile beat of his tiny heart, that someone would see him. But no one did. No one ever did, not yet. He had learned long ago that hope was dangerous. Hope made you stretch too far, reach too far, and the world always punished those who dared to stretch. So he curled tighter, wrapping his wet tail around himself like a fragile life preserver, waiting for the storm to pass. Even in the isolation, his senses were alive. Every drop of rain, every gust of wind, Every distant horn or shout was etched into his awareness. He could feel the tremor of the asphalt through the pads of his paw. He could smell the bread baking in a nearby corner store, the scent teasing him, a cruel reminder of a world where warmth and food existed, but were forever beyond reach. The puppy's stomach growled, an echoing ache that felt as loud as the traffic above. He licked at his dry tongue, tasting the salt of rain and mud, tasting nothing he could eat. Hunger was constant, an ache he carried like a second heartbeat, and yet it did not crush him entirely. Instinct, raw and unyielding, reminded him that survival was a series of small victories. One step at a time, one breath at a time, one heartbeat at a time. The rain began to lessen, thinning into a drizzle, and the puppy risked a glance upward. Shadows moved in the periphery. Legs, umbrellas, hurried faces, none stopped, none noticed. The indifference of the world weighed heavily on him, a constant pressure against the fragile walls of his mind. He wished he could shout, bark, make a sound loud enough to pierce through the noise, but fear gripped him too tightly. Even hunger could not push him far enough from instinct to demand attention. So he remained, pressed into the earth, a quiet, trembling shape that the world had forgotten. He remembered the first night he had dug the hollow. The rain had been just as relentless. He had been smaller then, weaker, trembling with a fear so intense it had made his legs almost fail beneath him. The hole had seemed impossibly vast, a cavernous space for a tiny creature, yet it had become home, the only place in a world that had offered nothing else. He had learned the rhythm of survival here, when to hide, when to sniff, when to wait. Each day, each night he had grown in the small ways the city allowed, a stronger paw, a sharper instinct, a flicker of courage that dared him to poke his nose above the mud and see what might happen. Now, as the drizzle softened, he dared the tiniest step forward, his paws squished in wet soil, his fur clinging in heavy sodden clumps, and the air smelled of fresh rain and hope so fragile it almost hurt. The edges of his hole had softened with the storm, mud collapsing slightly under his weight, but he did not care. He lifted his head, ears alert, and sniffed at the world beyond. There were smells here he had never fully known. Warm bread, damp grass, faint perfume from a passing human, the rich metallic tang of rain on iron. Every scent was a story, a fragment of life he had never been allowed to touch. For a moment he imagined stepping fully out, leaving the hollow behind. The idea made his chest tighten, made the muscles in his small legs twitch with anticipation and fear, but instinct was patient. It waited, it whispered, not. So he lowered his nose back to the wet earth, feeling the pulse of the world through his paws, letting his chest rise and fall with the rhythm of survival. The hollow was not safe, not entirely, but it was his. It was a beginning, a refuge carved from desperation, and for now that was enough. As the sun began to pierce the clouds in faint streaks of gray light, the puppy pressed himself further into the hole, feeling the warmth of the first tentative rays on his soaked fur. A bird chirped overhead, a sound so bright and impossible it made him blink, made him lift his head just enough to see a patch of sky. Somewhere in the distance a car honked, a human laughed, a dog barked, but here in his hollow, he felt the faint stirrings of life beyond survival. He could almost imagine it, a world where he was not invisible, where hunger was not constant, where fear did not rule every heartbeat. And though the city would not notice him, though the world would continue to rush past, he pressed his tiny chest against the mud, feeling the stubborn spark of life burn a little brighter. He would survive. He had to, and someday perhaps, he would discover what it meant to live. The drizzle had stopped, leaving the city slick and glimmering, wet surfaces reflecting fractured light, like scattered diamonds. The puppy poked his nose above the edge of his hollow, ears twitching at every sound. The world outside had always been vast, loud and dangerous, but today it felt like a puzzle waiting to be understood. He stepped forward, tentative, claws sinking into the soft mud at the entrance, feeling the cool wetness seep between his paws. Every step was a gamble, every shadow a possible predator, but the ache of hunger gnawed at him harder than the fear. He could smell scraps, broken sandwiches tossed aside, the faint tang of cooked meat from a nearby alley, a half-crushed chip bag that smelled like faint hope. Hunger propelled him forward, sharper than instinct, pushing him past caution. The alley was narrow and filled with debris, twisted cardboard, empty cans, and the occasional forgotten toy that smelled faintly of another life. The puppy sniffed carefully, ears flat, eyes wide. A rat scuttled across a puddle, pausing to stare, whiskers twitching, before disappearing under a crate. The puppy froze, muscles coiled tight, tail low, heart hammering. The city moved around him like a river of shadows and noise. Footsteps pounded on the wet sidewalk above. Voices murmured like distant thunder. Tires hissed over slick asphalt. Every movement could mean danger, but every still moment was death by inaction. He took a cautious step forward, then another, each movement deliberate, each breath measured. He discovered warmth in the strangest places. A pile of discarded blankets behind a shuttered store smelled faintly of human life, carrying traces of scent that made his stomach tighten in longing. He curled into the fabric, pressing his small body into the soft folds, letting the warmth seep into his bones. For a few moments the city's roar was distant, muffled by layers of fabric and the faint smell of home. Hunger had not left him, nor had fear, but this corner offered a pause, a whisper of comfort in a world that had rarely spared him such kindness. He drifted between shivering and resting, listening to the patter of residual rain dripping from gutters, the faint squeak of a rat somewhere near, the distant echo of car horns. Exploration brought both risk and revelation. A discarded sandwich crust sat near a puddle, and he approached cautiously, tail low, ears quivering. His teeth crunched the bread with a sound so loud in the alley that he froze after each bite, imagining someone noticing him and strike. Each mouthful was nourishment and terror combined, every swallow a small victory. He licked crumbs from his fur, tasting not just food but life itself. It was the first real taste of the outside world, not just survival from the hollow, and it sparked something faint but fierce curiosity. Perhaps there was more than hiding, more than trembling and waiting. Perhaps the world contained not only danger, but fragments of reward. The sounds of the city were relentless, yet he began to notice subtle whispers, the clink of a bottle rolling across wet concrete, the distant bark of a dog, harsh and territorial, the soft scrape of a broom against the doorway of a shop. Each sound told a story and he was learning to read them. A shadow moved across the alley, a cat, sleek and confident, pausing to observe him with golden eyes that glinted in the dim light. The puppy froze, instinct screaming at him to flee, but something within told him to watch, to understand. The cat hissed softly, tail flicking, and then vanished into the darkness. His heart slowed only slightly, but his curiosity had been. The city was alive, not just terrifying, and he was slowly learning the rhythm, the language of its shadows. Trust began in fragments. A human's dropped glove became an object of fascination, the scent of warmth and skin lingering on its fabric. He approached cautiously, sniffing, nudging with a tentative nose. The glove smelled faintly of soap, of the human who had held it, of safety. He pressed his tiny body against it, lingering longer than he intended, feeling a connection he had not known he craved. For a moment the world shrank from chaos to the scent of a hand that had reached without harm. It was startling, terrifying, and somehow exhilarating. He wondered, could the same hands that ignored him, that stepped over him countless times, ever offer? He did not know yet, but the thought stirred something deep within his chest, a flutter of hope he had buried beneath fear. Exploration brought him closer to danger too. A loud shout from above sent him skidding across wet asphalt, claws scrabbling for purchase. A car rolled too close, tires hissing on puddled concrete, forcing him to press low, ears flat, heartbeat racing. The city was a living, breathing creature, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Every sound and shadow was a test of courage, and the puppy realized he had been braver than he thought. Small victories, the sandwich, the blanket, the dropped glove, built a scaffold of confidence. He could survive beyond the hollow,
but only if he remembered every lesson the city had taught him, the sharpness of smell, the rhythm of sound, the subtle cues of movement that meant threat or opportunity. By evening, the puppy had ventured further than he had ever dared. The streets glimmered under wet lamplight, casting long, fractured shadows that danced across his path. He found a corner behind a shuttered shop, littered with remnants of human life, a broken toy, a tattered bag, the faint smell of. He curled into the shadows, paws tucked beneath him, ears twitching at distant echoes. He had survived another day, but more importantly, he had begun to see the threads that connected danger, life and small kindness. The world had not changed. It was still loud, still threatening, still indifferent to the smallest of creatures, yet within it he had found fragments, small glimpses of possibility that whispered of more than survival. The puppy pressed his nose against the cold concrete, tasting faint remnants of bread and warmth. He closed his eyes briefly, letting his mind drift over the day's discoveries. Every cautious step, every shiver, every hesitant bite of food had been a lesson. The hollow had taught him to hide. The alley had taught him to explore. Fear was still present, but it had been tempered by curiosity, by the faint thrill of life beyond mere survival. Somewhere beyond the shadows, he knew, the world might offer more than hunger and cold. Perhaps someday, he would find warmth without hiding, trust without fear. Perhaps. For now he rested in the quiet corners of the alley, the wet concrete beneath him, the remnants of scraps around him, listening to the city breathe. Each sound, each smell, each shadow was a story, and he was beginning to understand. He was no longer only the trembling creature in a hollow, he was a survivor, learning the rhythm of a world that had seemed impossibly large and cruel. The whispers in the shadows promised more than danger. They promised life in small, precious fragments, and he would follow them, one cautious step at a time. The puppy had learned the rhythm of the city, the language of shadows and puddles, but the streets were still indifferent. Hunger pressed against him like an iron band, and the memory of countless nights curled in the hollow gnawed at his bones. He moved cautiously, paws silent on slick asphalt, ears twitching at every sound. A distant bark, the screech of tires, the soft clatter of a tin can. Each sound meant potential danger, and yet something had shifted inside him. He was no longer only curiosity had taken root, fragile but insistent, stretching timid claws toward a world that might hold more than the ache of emptiness. It happened on an evening when the city smelled of rain-soaked earth and frying. The puppy was scavenging near a corner store, drawn by the scent of bread and cheese when a human approached. At first he froze, pressing low to the wet concrete, tail tucked, teeth barely visible in a quiet snarl. Instinct screamed at him to flee, to vanish into the nearest shadow, to trust nothing and no one. But there was something in the way the hand moved, not fast, not threatening, just reaching, trembling slightly, palm open. The scent of warmth, faint soap and gentleness drifted toward him, confusing the instincts that had kept him alive for so long. The human knelt, eyes soft, voice low and steady. "Hey little one. It's okay." The puppy flinched, pressed closer to the ground, but he did not run. Fear warred with hunger, curiosity, and the faintest whisper of hope. The hand inched closer, fingers curling like they were offering not command but invitation. He sniffed cautiously, nose twitching at the scent of safety, of hands that might feed, that might touch without harm. His stomach growled sharply, reminding him that hunger was the loudest voice he could not ignore. Step by tentative step, he edged closer, claws scraping lightly against wet concrete, ears low but twitching, heart hammering in a rhythm he could almost control. The hand stayed. It did not force him, did not reach too fast or strike too hard. There was a patience in it, a quiet insistence that something beyond survival could exist. The puppy pressed his nose forward, sniffing, whiskers brushing against the warm skin, tasting faint traces of human kindness he had never known. The world felt impossibly vast in that moment, yet impossibly small too, condensed into a hand, a voice, a scent that whispered, "You are not alone." He pressed closer, small paws tentatively touching the fingers, trembling as he realized that this did not hurt, did not strike, did not chase. Hunger made the decision for him. He pressed against the palm, licked it carefully, tasting warmth and soap and something he could not name. Safety. A quiet laugh came from the human, gentle and soft, and it startled him, but in a good way, not the terrifying sounds of the city, not the harsh tones of voices shouting from cars or sidewalks, but a sound that carried comfort. He pressed his head into the hand, trembling, letting the warmth spread into his soaked, dirty fur. For the first time he realized that fear could coexist with trust, that the world could hold hands that reached not to punish but to protect. The human crouched low, offering scraps of food. The puppy sniffed, wary at first, but hunger overcame caution. He nibbled tentatively, tasting bread and cheese that melted on his tongue like a dream. Every bite was a revelation. The world could sustain him, not just challenge him. The human watched quietly, letting him eat, letting him choose, letting him learn that connection was not a trap, but a gift. The puppy's small body relaxed fractionally, ears lifting slightly, tail twitching almost imperceptibly. The hollow, the shadows, the endless nights alone, all were still there in memory, but they were less sharp now. There was warmth here, faint and fragile but real. After the meal, the human extended the hand again. This time the puppy did not hesitate. He pressed against it fully, body trembling but no longer in terror alone. He allowed a gentle touch along his soaked back, a slow, careful stroke that carried understanding rather than command. His fur bristled and then softened under the touch, and for the first time he felt a connection that was not survival, not instinct but something deeper, something he had almost forgotten existed. The city moved around them, indifferent as ever. Yet in that small corner a bubble of quiet existence emerged. He was being seen, truly seen. Night fell, and the city lights reflected off wet asphalt in golden shards. The puppy stayed near the human, ears alert, yet comforted by the steady presence. Trust was still new, tentative, fragile as the threads of a spider's web, but it had been planted. He realized he could move differently now, not just to hide, but to exist, to explore with the possibility that the world might hold more than danger. The hollow was still a memory, a training ground for survival, but this hand, this voice, this warmth, it was the first step toward something else, companionship, care and the faintest whisper of love. The puppy drifted closer into a pile of blankets offered by the human, curling into them as rain began anew in distant streets. The city still roared, still demanded attention with harsh lights and sharp sounds, but he had learned that not every hand meant harm, not every shadow meant threat. There were fragments of kindness scattered across the city, and sometimes if you were brave enough to reach out, they could touch you. He pressed his head into the warmth, chest rising and falling in exhausted relief. Fear had not vanished, hunger had not disappeared, but trust had begun, and that was enough to ignite a spark that would grow. And as he drifted into a restless sleep, the puppy allowed himself a quiet thought. Perhaps the world was not entirely cruel, perhaps there were hands that could reach across the abyss of loneliness, and perhaps he did not have to survive alone anymore. The city had grown darker, heavier as clouds rolled in thick and low, spilling rain in sheets that hammered asphalt and glass alike. The puppy pressed himself beneath the awning of a shuttered shop, fur slick with wetness, heart hammering from the memory of near misses on streets that had become more unpredictable in the storm. Thunder rolled across the sky, vibrating through the concrete, and every flash of lightning painted the alley in stark, blinding white. The hollow was gone from memory now, replaced by the chaos of the city, the presence of a human hand that had once offered warmth. But the storm reminded him that survival was still a test, that life was not gentle and courage had to be earned again and again.
The puddles reflected fractured light as the puppy ventured out, cautious but drawn forward by hunger and instinct. The car roared past, tires skimming wet concrete, sending ripples that threatened to soak him fully. He leapt back, paws slipping, claws scrabbling for grip, heart in his throat. Each step forward was a negotiation with fear. The world was loud, unforgiving, and utterly alive. The scent of rain-soaked trash and spilled food mingled with ozone from the storm, overwhelming his senses, yet he pressed on, nostrils flaring, ears low but alert. Every shadow could hold a predator, every sound could be a threat, and yet beneath the fear a thread of courage had begun to wind through him, subtle and persistent, urging him forward. A sudden movement, a larger dog charging through the alley, sent the puppy skidding across the wet ground. He pressed flat against the wall, teeth bared, ears pinned, trembling with terror. The larger dog sniffed, growled, and then disappeared as quickly as it had arrived, leaving Puppy shaking, fur plastered to his spine, heart racing like a drumbeat in his chest. Relief mingled with adrenaline, a sharp cocktail that made him acutely aware of his own fragility. But he had survived, he had endured. And somewhere deep in his chest, courage flared again, tiny but undeniable. Survival was no longer just instinct. It had become choice, a decision to step forward despite fear. The human's presence had taught him another lesson. Connection could exist even in a storm. The puppy remembered the warmth, the soft touch, the gentle voice, and it gave him the faintest spark of daring. Hunger gnawed at him, and yet he hesitated before scavenging near the puddles, ears twitching at the sound of hurried footsteps and distant shouts. Every shadow was alive, every movement a possible threat. Yet he crept forward, paws wet and muddy, nose twitching, sniffing fragments of discarded food washed along the gutters. Each bite was a victory, each swallow a reaffirmation that he could claim fragments of life even amidst chaos. The storm intensified, rain fell in relentless sheets, wind whipping through alleys and between buildings like an invisible predator. The puppy darted toward a faint shelter, a recessed doorway filled with debris. But before he could reach it, a sudden flash of lightning illuminated the street, and a car skidded dangerously close. He pressed low to the ground, claws biting into wet asphalt, muscles trembling with tension. Instinct screamed, heart racing faster than ever, yet he did not flee blindly. He calculated, measured, waited, and in a heartbeat, darted safely into the shadows, narrowly avoiding the screeching vehicle. Survival required more than instinct now. It required courage, timing, and an understanding of the chaos surrounding him. The wind tore at him, rain plastered fur to skin, and yet he pressed on. A pile of cardboard offered fleeting cover, and he curled into it, shivering, chest heaving. The city was merciless, but he had learned to move within it, to read its signals, to carve a small space of safety amidst torrents of noise, water, and danger. Each step, each shiver, each near miss honed him, sharpened. Courage was no longer abstract, it was his heartbeat, his legs, his very paws pushing forward despite fear, despite rain, despite hunger. The evening brought no respite. Water surged in shallow puddles along streets, carrying fragments of trash and scraps that could feed or choke. The puppy balanced carefully, sniffing and testing each step, ears alert to sudden sounds, eyes scanning for movement. A larger dog barked aggressively in the distance. He froze, small body pressed to the ground, fur bristled, teeth barely showing. Yet he did not retreat entirely. Instead he calculated, waited, and in a flicker of instinct honed by hours of survival, he edged past the threat. Every muscle coiled, every sense acute. Courage was not the absence of fear, it was moving forward with fear intact, and he embodied it fully now. Eventually the puppy found a corner that offered temporary refuge, a collapsed awning above, a pile of dryish cardboard beneath, faint warmth from a nearby vent. He pressed himself low, chest rising and falling, eyes half closed but alert, ears twitching at every sound. The storm raged on, but within this small bubble, he caught a fragment of calm. He realized he had grown. The hollow had taught him to survive. The city had tested him with shadows and near-death experiences, and now, in the midst of chaos, courage had taken root in his chest. It was still small, fragile, but it was undeniable. In the quiet between gusts of wind and the roll of thunder, he allowed himself to imagine something more. A world where the city was not just danger, where hands could reach without harm,
where warmth existed beyond scraps and hidden corners. The memory of the human hand lingered, a reminder that trust and care were possible. The storm would pass. The city would remain chaotic and unpredictable, but he had learned something profound. Courage, once discovered, could guide even the smallest, weakest creatures through the harshest night. As the first faint streaks of moonlight pierced the clouds, casting silver across wet streets, the puppy lifted his head. Water dripped from his ears, fur matted and heavy, but his eyes gleamed with an inner light. He had survived he had faced the larger dog, the skidding car, the unrelenting rain, and he had pressed on. Survival had evolved into courage. Hunger still gnawed, cold still bit, and fear still lingered, but he had discovered something more. He could endure, he could move forward, he could be brave. And as he curled into the cardboard, listening to the storm retreat into distant rumble, the puppy felt it in the deepest part of his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with food, a light that had nothing to do with sun, a courage born of endurance. The hollow had given him safety, the city had given him lessons, and now, amid rain and shadow, he had begun to understand what it meant to live, not just survive. The city had quieted in the early morning, streets still wet from the night's storm, the air smelling of rain-soaked asphalt and faint earth. The puppy padded cautiously through puddles, fur matted but heart lighter than it had been in weeks. The storm had passed, but the memories lingered, the scrape of claws on wet concrete, the roar of engines, the glare of headlights slicing through darkness. Yet now, there was something different, a sense of rhythm in the chaos, a pulse he could move with instead of against. Courage had taken root and it made each step feel less desperate, more deliberate. He paused near a corner, ears flicking at a distant sound, a soft whistle, gentle and coaxing. His tiny body stiffened, instinct screaming caution, but there was something familiar in the tone, a memory of warmth and care he could not ignore. Slowly he lifted his nose and sniffed the air. The scent of soap, faint bread and a human's presence mingled with the city's usual chaos. Hunger gnawed, but it was tempered by something new, recognition. Someone had come for him. He stepped cautiously forward, claws sinking into wet concrete, muscles coiled with anticipation, and the human crouched in the corner, arms open, eyes warm, voice low and steady. "Come on, little one. It's okay." The puppy froze, tail tucked, but the hunger for connection outweighed the instinct to flee. Step by tentative step, he approached, nose twitching, whiskers brushing against the air. The hand moved slowly, deliberately, palm open in invitation, carrying not command but patience, not threat but hope. He sniffed, ears flattened, and then, after a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, pressed against the hand, trembling. The warmth spread through him, a soft fire, after weeks of cold, a pulse of safety that seemed impossibly bright. The human's voice whispered softly, as they stroked his fur, careful not to startle him. Each touch built a bridge over fear, a fragile path to trust that the puppy navigated with tentative hunger still existed, but it was secondary now. The craving for safety and connection outweighed it, and he leaned into the warmth, letting himself be held for the first time in a long while. The city roared around them, indifferent and alive, but in that small bubble nothing else mattered. Fear was still present, a whisper at the edges, but courage and trust had grown enough to overshadow it. The human offered a bowl of food, and the puppy approached slowly, eyes wide. Every bite was a revelation, not just nourishment, but proof that kindness existed in the world. The flavor of warm bread and soft meat lingered on his tongue, mingling with the scent of safety and touch. Each swallow built confidence, each chew reinforced a simple truth. He was no longer invisible, no longer alone. He could rest without hiding, eat without fleeing, breathe without constant terror. The hollow, the alleys, the endless nights alone, all were still a part of him, but they had been transformed from prisons into lessons, scars into reminders of strength and survival. The city lights reflected off puddles in long ribbons of silver and gold, casting fractured patterns across the street. The puppy followed the human, small paws slapping lightly on wet concrete, tail lifting in cautious joy. Every sound, distant car clattering trash, faint bird song, was no longer a threat, but part of the rhythm he had learned to navigate. He stepped over debris with deliberate care, ears flicking at soft noises, eyes scanning, yet moving with a quiet confidence he had never known. Courage had become instinct. Trust had taken root alongside it. They stopped near a small park, patches of grass still damp from the storm. The puppy sniffed, hesitated, and then bounded forward, paws sinking into the soft earth, body trembling not with fear but with exhilaration. The wind carried scents of other animals, food and earth, weaving a tapestry of life he could now fully inhabit. He rolled in the grass briefly, ears flopping, tail wagging, fur sticky but spirit sore. For the first time, he understood what freedom could feel like, not just survival, not just endurance, but joy untainted by terror. The human sat nearby, smiling softly, watching without intrusion, letting the puppy explore this new world on his own terms. Every glance, every small movement, reinforced the lesson he had learned through months of struggle. Connection is possible, warmth is not a trap, and the world can hold care alongside chaos. He had survived storms, predators, hunger and neglect, but now he had something more powerful, belonging. Trust, once a fragile seed, had grown into a slender vine strong enough to support hope. As the sun broke fully through clouds, casting golden light across wet streets and glimmering leaves, the puppy paused. He pressed a small muddy paw to the human's hand, eyes lifting in silent gratitude. The city was vast, alive and still unpredictable, but he had learned how to navigate it. He had discovered courage in rain and fear, warmth in the touch of a patient hand, and joy in movement unchained from terror. The hollow and alleys of survival had forged him, but love and trust were shaping him into something more, not merely a survivor, but a being capable of connection, of hope, of delight in the simple act of living. The puppy curled at the human's side as the morning unfolded, tail brushing damp grass, chest rising and falling with quiet ease. He had learned the rhythm of life beyond mere survival, the pulse of trust, the heartbeat of courage, the gentle glow of belonging. The city hummed around them, indifferent yet beautiful, and he was ready to move through it, no longer hidden in shadow, no longer trembling, no longer alone. He had faced storms, danger, hunger and fear, and he had emerged whole, tiny but unbroken, a creature capable of hope. And as the first rays of sunlight touched his wet fur, glinting like threads of gold, he pressed his small muddy nose to the human's hand once more, and closed his eyes, finally understanding. He was seen, and the world, harsh and relentless though it might be, had offered him a chance to live, not just survive.